All right guys, we're back with another shooting tips video in this series where I'm breaking down my traditional archery shot cycle. Now, earlier on in this series, we covered the first point of contact with the bow, which is the bow hand. In this video, we're going to be covering the hook. Before we get started on this video, I want to go ahead and remind you to click that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we have got some great videos coming up in this series. We're going to continue talking about the physical aspects of archery, but then we are going to transition into the mental side of things, which is absolutely massive. We're going to talk about target panic, buck fever, which eats a lot of guys up. And if you are new to the series and haven't checked out the ones we've already done, we've covered archery form, we've covered bow hand position and things like that. So go back and check out some of those videos. And with that, let's get rolling. So whenever I do these technique videos, I like to do some research online just to make sure that I'm covering everything, that I'm not leaving things out. And when I was doing the research on the archery hook or how you put your fingers on a string, I quickly came to realize that there is a ton of information out there for split finger shooters, but there's really not a lot of information that addresses the hook for 3-under shooters. So this video is going to focus primarily on 3-under shooting, which is the way that I shoot. But if you do shoot split fingers, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and there are probably some tips that you're going to be able to pick up if you want to stick with split finger. Before we get into talking about the hook for 3-under shooters, I want to briefly touch on one main point for split finger guys. If you look at any of the top level Olympic style shooters, any of the Olympic style shooters really, they're all shooting split finger and they're all shooting a tab with a spacer between their middle finger and their pointer finger. And what that allows them to do is to grip that string, and it maintains a little bit of a gap between their index finger and the arrow. One thing that has created problems for me in the past, and I think creates problems for a lot of guys that shoot split finger, is putting a downward angle on this index finger when you're drawing the bow. And what that does is it gets the tip of your index finger caught in a little wedge between the arrow and the bowstring here. Now what this is usually caused by is allowing the bottom of your hand to kind of roll out a little bit, and that just forces that finger down into that wedge there. When you're shooting split finger, it's really important that you maintain your hand on the same plane as the bow. So if you're shooting with a canted bow, you need to maintain that same plane with the back of your hand. That's going to help to eliminate or alleviate that finger getting caught in that wedge down there. Now when you're shooting 3-under, it's really not that big of an issue because you don't have that finger above the arrow to get caught in that wedge. It's not a big issue unless you start to do it so dramatically that you're twisting the string and putting a lot of pressure on the nock of your arrow with the top edge of your finger here. If you're shooting split fingers, that is something that you definitely need to keep an eye on. And that's all I'm really going to say about that. But there are some great resources online. There's a ton of information online about a good, solid hook for split finger shooters. So I'll just direct you to check out some of that stuff. All right, so I'm going to break this hook concept down into 3 categories. And these are just categories that I've come up with. There's nothing official about this. But I'm going to say a shallow hook, a medium hook, and a deep hook. And I'll define a shallow hook as having the string on basically your fingertips, so in front of that first crease on your fingers. A medium hook is going to place the string in the crease of the middle finger and just slightly in front of the creases on your index and your ring finger. A deep hook is going to be behind those creases, so anywhere on the pad between the first and second crease on your fingers. There's 2 functions that the hook has to perform. One is to allow the archer to draw the bow with a relaxed forearm and wrist, and that point is very important. And number 2, to allow for a quick and smooth release. And like with many other things in archery, these 2 things can sometimes be a trade-off. So we'll take a look at the shallow hook as an example of that. So in theory, the shallow hook is going to allow for the quickest, smoothest release because you have the least amount of contact with the bowstring, you have the least amount of finger to clear when you do release that string. But for me, when I try to shoot a hunting weight bow, so we're talking 50 plus pounds, when I try to shoot a hunting weight bow with a shallow hook, meaning the string tip or the string out towards my fingertips, I have to build up extra tension in my forearm just to be able to hold that string. And extra tension in the forearm is not doing us any good at all. Remember, we have to draw to be consistent and to have a nice, smooth, fluid release. We need to reduce that tension in the forearm and the wrist as much as possible. And for me, for a hunting weight bow, a shallow hook just does not do that. Now we'll take a look at the opposite end of the spectrum, and that's a deep hook. So that's anything beyond that first crease on the fingers. This is something that I hear a lot of guys talking about as being beneficial to them. So they'll take a relatively deep hook on the fingers, sometimes even going all the way to that second crease. Now for me, this makes drawing the bow with a relaxed wrist and a relaxed forearm very easy. So you've got that going for you, but there's a lot of finger wrapped around that string, and when you go to release, it just takes a little bit longer. Let's take a look at how long it takes the string to clear the fingers with each one of these hooks. This was filmed on a GoPro at 240 frames per second, and we'll start the time at the first sign of movement in the forearm muscles that are required to hold the string. For the shallow hook, it takes approximately 8 frames, or 3/100ths of a second for the string to clear the fingers. For the medium hook, it's about the same in 8 frames and 3/100ths of a second. The deep hook, on the other hand, takes approximately 50% longer at 12 frames and 5/100ths of a second. Now this might not sound like much, but when you consider that the arrow is completely clear of the bow with both the shallow and the medium hook, before the string even clears the finger on the deep hook, that sounds pretty significant to me. Personally, I prefer something kind of in the middle. When I place my fingers on the string, I'm actually lining up all 3 creases on my fingers. But as I start to put a little bit of tension on that string, the string actually goes just slightly in front of the crease on my index finger and slightly in front of the crease on my ring finger. It stays in the crease on my middle finger. I like to have a double knock set on my bow. I'll have one above, and then I'll also have one just below with just a small gap, maybe a 1/16 of an inch between the arrow's nock and this bottom knock set. So that's gonna help maintain the arrow or keep the arrow exactly where it's supposed to be. But then it's also gonna give me a really definite spot to slide my tab up so that I know that I'm in the exact same spot with each and every shot. Additionally, if I roll my hand out a little bit, it's really not that big of an issue because there is a gap, just a small gap between my finger and the nock of that arrow. So if I happen to roll my hand out a little bit and get my fingers at a little bit of an angle, they're still not touching the arrow, and they're not placing or putting a bunch of pressure on that arrow, because that can cause some pretty serious tuning issues. If you, for example, if you have a bow where if you're shooting 3 under, and you cannot get rid of nock high, that might be something to check out. Just move your tab down just a little bit so that you're not touching that arrow when you go to shoot. When you start looking around for information on the archer's hook, you're gonna come across some recommendations for how much pressure needs to be put on each one of these 3 fingers. And a lot of the recommendations will say maybe 50% of the pressure on your middle finger, 30 to 40 on your index finger, and 10 to 20 on your ring finger here. All of those recommendations that I have found have been for split finger shooters, and I'm not sure that that applies very well to 3 under shooters. I couldn't tell you with any level of accuracy how much weight or what the breakdown of weight is by finger that I'm carrying when I draw this bow, but I could say that it's probably a lot more even than that. If I had to put numbers on it, I would say that I'm carrying 40% of the weight with my middle finger, 30% with my top and 30% with my bottom. So as far as how deeply to hook the string, that's just something that you are gonna have to play around with and figure out for yourself, because each person shoots a little bit differently. But if I were to recommend something, I would say prioritize a relaxed forearm and a relaxed wrist over a quick release. If that means you need to hook a little bit deeper to maintain that relaxed forearm, then do that. If you can use a hook where you can get that string a little bit farther out on your fingers, but still maintain a relaxed forearm or relaxed wrist, that's gonna be ideal. All right, guys, that ought to give you something to think about until next week. Just remember to stay relaxed and have fun. If you're not subscribed to the channel, go ahead and click that thing and turn on notifications. We'll be back next week with another shooting video. And I wanna thank everybody that signed up for Patreon, because those guys are really, they're the reason that I'm able to put these videos out. And if you're not signed up for Patreon, there's a ton of exclusive content over there. Most of it's focused on bow building, but there are some shooting tips as well. So go over there and check it out. With that, we'll see you guys next time.